Hey everyone, it's Jen.
And this is Lindsay.
And this is Corpus Delicti, the podcast. We are still in our cold case series, going strong. And just a warning, this episode, don't listen to it on your speaker. Go get you some earbuds, because you may need it.
Yeah, there are some pretty gruesome details, and it does include sexual assault. So if that is not your thing, please feel free to skip this episode. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in because there is a lot to cover. So we're going to kick this off on May 3rd of 1996. This was Jessica Baggen's 17th birthday. And by May 4th, which is just the very, very next day, she had disappeared. Jessica disappeared in the early morning hours of May 4th, 1996 in Sitka, Alaska. So she and her friend had been at her sister's house, visiting her sister, where Jessica was celebrating her birthday. So she's with a friend, with her sister, at the sister's house on May 3rd. This goes into the wee morning hours of May 4th, and that's when she decides to walk home that night at approximately 1:30 a.m. It's about a mile away, so she's like, it's close enough. I've done it before. Weather's not bad. I'm going to go. Now, her parents woke up the next morning, and they realized Jessica was not home. They called her sister. She was not with her sister. They spend the rest of the day making calls. They're looking for Jessica. And Jessica's father reported her missing to the Sitka Police Department early on May the 5th.
They managed to determine that no one had had contact with her, or at least that they knew of. No friends or family had seen or heard from her. A search and rescue team was established, and they focused on the woods west of the Indian River near Sheldon-Jackson College campus. The search soon turned up a shirt. It was identified as having been worn by Jessica when she left her sister's house. Unfortunately, 2 hours later on May 6th, Jessica was found deceased. She had been basically dumped, for a lack of any better term. It was floppy, and she was buried in a very hollowed-out tree trunk, and the tree had actually fallen down. She had been raped and asphyxiated. Dirt had been forcibly shoved into her mouth. Her eyes were black from being struck by a blunt object. Her body was scratched, and they think that this was because she had been dragged along the ground.
She was found about 70 feet off of a bike path, and it wasn't long after that that they found her clothing and all of her belongings nearby. So among these items, there was a pack of cigarettes. These were assumed to be hers, and there was one fingerprint that could not be identified on this box of cigarettes. Her scrunchie, which, if you don't know the term scrunchie, it's a type of a hair tie. It was found off of the bike path in this grassy area, and her jeans, which were not on her, were found to have grass stains on them. So again, looking like she was on the ground, possibly drug through. Now, it's stereotypical to say this, but this area really was seen as a safe place. Residents here said, we are way more worried about dangerous wildlife than we are people. In fact, the only things that happened in this area were reports of people playing croquet too loudly, and one time there was a suspicious $1 bill that made the news. I mean, this sort of thing just does not happen here. This town is only about 8,000 people, and obviously this caused a lot of concern. So they had a town hall meeting just to discuss the safety concerns that arose from this. Do we have enough lighting? Is it too dark on the roads? That sort of thing. So according to an article in the Daily Sentinel, this was the only murder there ever where the person had not been caught immediately. So most of the time there were, domestic issues that resulted in a husband killing a wife or vice versa, and they were able to put those pieces together very fast. This one did not happen that way. Residents did wonder if there was some sort of trend happening or a pattern forming, because the year before, there had been another sexual assault in that same park. However, that person, much like all these murders that we talked about, had been arrested and convicted quickly. So the police were like, no, that can't be related. It has to be a separate issue.
The autopsy determined there were no defensive wounds. It didn't seem like she fought back. Was it because she got hit first? Did she get hit in the eyes? That's why she has those black eyes? The bones in her throat were crushed, but a determination would not be made as really how did that happen? Her mouth was so full of dirt that her tongue was pushed up and back, blocking any chance of her getting air. On May 12, 1996, over 1,500 people gathered in the Sitka National Historical Park for a vigil just for the memory of Jessica. On May 29, something kind of bittersweet was done, right? The town had found a male adult bald eagle the week Jessica was found. The eagle was injured, so they rehabilitated it. They named it Jessie after Jessica, and they did a quote-unquote eagle release in her honor, which is so sweet. They wanted to commemorate her memory, and this was the way that they knew best how. Now, Jessica's sister, Melissa, said it was sad that somebody with such a free spirit like Jessica had her life cut so short. We're hoping that this release will help us in the healing process.
So this case actually has a pretty quick resolution at first. So only 9 days after finding her, something really big happens. A 34-year-old man named Richard Bingham comes into the police department. Now, Bingham is known around town. He is a heavy drinker. He lives on a boat in the harbor. He's a janitor at the local college. But since Bingham is a heavy drinker, he would often black out. And this is where people kind of got to know him. They know him for this because his friends would often prank him when he would black out. And the next day they'd be like, "Why did you do that last night?" Or, "I bet you did this." And he'd be like, "What? What happened?" And he would have no recollection. And we'll get more into that later. But they would actually listen to police scanners and use actual crimes so that if he saw something in the paper, he'd be like, "Oh my God, my friends told me I did that." I mean, it's a terrible thing to do. So one of these friends said the next day after all the news about Jessica being found breaks, says, "Hey man, do you think maybe you had something to do with this killing?" And the friend said that in recalling this, that Bingham had been stressed out that day. He looked really stressed out. And he, being the friend, looked at the newspaper, saw the article about Jessica, and he says, "I was picking on him. He was stressed out. I kind of went a little overboard. I opened the door and I screamed, 'Richard did it.'" Well, as a result of this, Richard hears this. He doesn't recall anything. And he starts having disturbing dreams and flashbacks. And these dreams and flashbacks are really concerning to him, enough to make him think that, actually, I think maybe I did do this.
So Bingham goes to the police station and says, "Hey, here's the deal. Can you help me figure this out?" He says the night of the murder, he was super drunk. He took hydrocodone and he can't remember anything, but he's having all of these flashbacks. He tells them that these flashbacks and dreams were him meeting someone on a bike path, going into the woods, burying something and just washing his hands in the river. Obviously, the police are taking this seriously. They question him. They use what's called the REID technique. This technique is actually developed back in the 1950s. It's considered an accusatory process and has been controversial for the very, very high false confessions, especially in teens and those who are mentally disabled. Basically, it assumes, hey, you're guilty, and limits the questions to, did you mean to kill her or was it an accident?
Yeah, it kind of limits those questions to only allowing the person to give an answer that admits that they did it. So did you mean to kill her or was it an accident? Well, that doesn't leave the option for, I didn't kill her. That is, it was an accident. And, somebody who's mentally disabled or something of that nature may not be able to distinguish that that is what's happening.
Right. And there's 9 more steps, and we're not going to go through all 9, but basically it says, hey, all the evidence brought to us points us right to you. Tell us what happened. And then offering like an a reason why out of it. Be like, man, she was having an affair, or man, she was being mean to you. She deserved this. Or in this case, Richard, the family wants closure on this. And I think you need closure. You have to do the right thing. And this actually ends in a confession by Richard Bingham. And he says at one point, yes, I guess I did it, but I want the test to verify it. He essentially goes on to say that he met Jessica on the bike path near Totem Park, wrapped his arms around her neck, choking her, and then had sex with her, and then he buried her body. Now remember, he's blackout drunk that night.
But what's interesting here is, keep in mind, he's blackout drunk. He doesn't even sound convinced. He says, I guess I did it, but he also wants proof. So that tells you he's like, okay, I admit, I can't tell you I didn't do it, but we still need to prove this. I think maybe I did, but let's still back it up. Now, as far as that evidence and seeing if the pieces fit, well, quite frankly, a lot of it did, albeit it was circumstantial. But when you put it under the lens of this REID or REID technique, it doesn't look so clear cut. So the police fed him details that he did agree or half agree with. But whenever he gave information up himself, none of it fit. So they're like, all right, well, he was under stress, whatever. Let's see what the physical evidence says. Well, the physical evidence comes back months later, and none of it matches Bingham. Now, for example, the first thing that tells them, something's off here, is there was a reddish blonde pubic hair that had been found on Jessica, was not hers, and it was obviously from the killer. Well, he did not have reddish blonde hair, so that's the first thing where they're like, hang on.
Now, another example, in his interview, they asked Bingham about any sexual assault. He replied, I got her from behind, I guess. They asked if there were anything else, and he said no. Well, this wasn't true. They were able to determine that she had, very unfortunately, been raped from, let's just say, both locations. They'd also asked him how he kept her quiet, to which he responded, I whacked her in the head with a piece of wood. The person who conducted the autopsy later said there's no splinters or indications whatsoever that it was wood. Bingham had already been in jail for over a year because he's waiting his trial, right? When he first arrived, he spent the first few months in isolation because they thought he was dangerous. He's a blackout drunk. He doesn't have a history of violence. He doesn't have a criminal history, maybe except public intoxication. And that's a stretch, right?
So the case still goes to trial in 1997 because at this point they don't have anybody else. Right. They don't have anything else. So it actually had to be moved because of not being able to find an impartial jury. Again, small town, this caused a lot of emotion. They're not used to anything like this. Now, the prosecution is going in with a confession, right? So that's a big deal. That's a slam dunk. It should be a slam dunk. You're going in with someone saying, I did this. So the prosecution plays the tape. They play this whole confession and them questioning him and getting all the details. Well, this ended up hurting them because at one point, Bingham mentioned red clay at the site, as well as the sweat clothes that Jessica was wearing. Well, there was no red clay at the site, and she wasn't wearing sweat clothes. They know exactly what she was wearing. Keep in mind, she was with people before this. We also hear him say that he bit the victim on the back. Well, there was no bite on her. But when Bingham would say something that did not match in this tape that they're playing, in court, the police would say, well, let's not get hung up on that. So
because it didn't fit their narrative.
Exactly. So the defense then brings in a false confession expert who says that Bingham was very vulnerable to suggestion and he had intellectual deficiencies, which is what we were saying. This method that they used is basically a big problem with people with intellectual deficiencies. Now, remember, his friends used to trick him into doing things he didn't do. This also suggests that he was very vulnerable to suggestion. And to prove this point, he actually once returned a salmon to the store because his friends told him that he stole it. So he takes it to the store owner and he says, "Look, I took this. I'm sorry." The store owner said, "Man, go home. That never happened." So,
What kind of friends are these?
yeah, this is cruel. So it's super interesting, though, because one thing that they said is that there are certain tactics that often lead to false confession more than others, right? So this expert is confirming this on the stand. And here are some of the things that he outlined that says you need to watch for. And it's one of these is telling a suspect that they have evidence against them when they don't. Well, this happened. They said, "Hey, look, we've got you for this." Another is for police to tell the suspect that they know they committed the crime, but they must not remember because they repressed it. Well, this happened. People who believe they have repressed memories or who are giving false confessions, they often make statements that are paired with vague words like probably or I guess. Well, we know that happened. And then another thing that the expert said was very dangerous, his words, very dangerous when used with scared people and them falsely confessing is when police offer the suggestion that it could have been an accident. And all of this happens on the video. So they've got this expert testifying as to what to look for in a false confession. And then they've got the video that the prosecution brought in showing everything that he's saying.
They also presented the DNA evidence, which absolutely not a match. How the heck does this happen? And he has made it to trial, which is an absolute failboat on our judicial system. There was semen found in her underwear. This excluded Bingham and matched with one of her ex-boyfriends who testified that they had indeed hooked up, but that was the day before. He also learned that there was blood in her bra, not her own, nor was it Bingham's. They also confirmed that the pubic hairs were not Bingham, and his hair was obviously a different color. They also were not the ex-boyfriends. So a few students from a nearby college testified that they heard a scream not long after Jessica has last been seen by her sister. Now, this college is right near the woods. There is also an alibi. Richard had been on a boat with several friends that night who testified to being there with him, although Richard was drunk, hence why he couldn't remember. None of these people remembered him being dirty, bruised, scratched. They also said he never left the boat. Another expert testified that Bingham's fingerprints weren't found anywhere on anything. However, just because there aren't prints being found doesn't mean, obviously, the person can't wear gloves or, to that effect. Additionally, a defense psychologist testified that Bingham had a personality disorder that made him paranoid, and this gave him really low self-esteem. He specified that the paranoia isn't bad enough to make him hear voices or anything like that, but it does cause a lot of mistrust. He easily misinterprets social cues to fit his belief that others think very poorly of him. It also means that he's dependent upon the approval of others for reinforcement, and he's highly susceptible to being differential to authority. What that means is if there is someone in an authoritative position, a boss, a policeman, a fireman, he is going to be very submissive. He is going to say, "Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, I'll do it." He is very much a rule follower. And this could have contributed to his false confession because he is a people pleaser. He wants to be liked. He wants to have friends. And he has such low self-esteem that he goes above and beyond, even when it's detrimental to himself. But what about all these things that he said that did match? Well, keep in mind, big story in the small town. The details that are out there are everywhere. They're on the local news. It's anything someone's talking about. It's in the newspaper. Also, suggestions were made through questioning. Did you strangle her versus did you kill her? Well, when you put the dirt in her mouth, what were you thinking? So they're leading into these questions that are giving evidence and it's giving facts about it that nobody else would know so they can manipulate it and turn it against him. But how is the jury going to rule on this? Well, we're not going to know until we come back from our break. All right, welcome back. We are getting down deep into the details. It is day 10 of this trial, and Bingham is found not guilty on all of the charges after a very short deliberation. That jury only took 2 hours. That's super fast. And normally when you come back that fast, you're like, dude is definitely guilty. We know it. Seen it, heard it. We're going to give you our verdict. But it's weird that this came back flipped as not guilty.
Yeah, they knew. It was like no question, pretty much all on the same page. So the jurors ranged from ages of late 20s to early 60s. They came from varying socioeconomic backgrounds. All were white, but there were no objections brought up to that during the jury selection process. They got the varying ages and socioeconomic statuses that they felt like it was still representative. There were 9 men and 5 women, including alternates. And just because I think it's interesting, I'm just fascinated by how a trial works and jury selection and all that. Potential jurors were asked if they had any friends or family in the healthcare profession, particularly psychiatry, whether they were devotees of law enforcement TV shows or programs that discuss details of crimes, and what they thought about the possibility of people having flashbacks. Now, that question about, are you a true crime fan is basically what that question is. I'm not sure if they did or didn't want those folks, but that's us. And I've always thought, if Jen and I get called for jury duty, which Jen did, we're going to be cut immediately because they're going to search our names. And Jen was. They're going to search our names and see the podcast and be like, no. But in reality, they should want us because we are constantly looking at the details of a case. So I just find the whole jury selection process very, very interesting.
Or if you want to get out of jury duty, start a podcast.
Yeah, a true crime one, apparently. So one juror who was selected said that his daughter was killed in a violent crime and he was not entirely sure he could remain impartial. But what made them say, we still want you, is, and in fact, the defense themselves wanted him, is because he said that his father-in-law experienced alcohol-related blackouts a lot. So he was able to know the effects of what, that would have on this case potentially. So I just think it's really interesting how we choose jurors.
So Bingham, after being fully decided not guilty, he's going to move out of the area because he's fearing for his safety. His attorney said, the police are exceptionally anxious to find the predator and unfortunately centered in on basically a vulnerable person. The jury recognized an innocent man, and when they saw one, they did the right thing. This is what a jury is for, to serve as a buffer between the police and the courts. Now, of course, after all of this, the police are heavily criticized. And to be fair, they had someone walk into their precinct and confess. To be fair to them, the detective who had done the interview responded by saying, I don't think we did anything wrong whatsoever. That's about all I want to comment on that. I see his point. I don't picture them as the villain. They have someone coming in off the street confessing, saying, hey, I did this, but you need to prove it.
Well, he didn't confess, but he definitely gave them a very, very, very strong lead. I would say that the interrogation technique is strongly flawed, but that's not necessarily on them if that's how they were trained. It's not great. And do you have to use that one? I don't really know.
And do you go in there and go, hey, I'm a vulnerable person.
Right.
You can't use this technique on me. How are they supposed? Small town, I get it. But how is the police force or interviewer supposed to know this going into it? So I see it both ways.
But
Did they put on too much pressure?
Crappy interrogation technique, and it should be done away with. And on another note, good for the defense attorney because the judge commended her for, quote, the most competent attack on a confession that he has seen in 25 years as a lawyer and judge. So that's pretty impressive. But investigators, the police department, sucks for them because they are now back to square one. This crime is now unsolved. I mean, this was a brutal murder and this person is still out there. So they looked into 100 potential suspects. They were all cleared through DNA. So not just alibis and all that, like actual DNA. So now they're like, what the heck do we do?
The case was reopened in 2007 by one of the officers who originally investigated the case. He is now over the Alaska State Trooper Cold Case Investigation Unit. Jessica's case had always stuck with him, and he wanted to take a new look at it. He said, every retired officer seems to have that one case they can't let go. It just haunts them. This case was mine. Now, that came from Lieutenant Dave Tugman. He also goes on to say, I walked into the captain's office with a file and told him we had to take on Jessica's case. And to be fair, this is a very highly publicized case. Of course, they're going to want to find this killer because Jessica was just a minor. And he did. He's using DNA. He's using it, anything he can think of. He has spent years on it and he's had no luck. This is a small department, not a ton of resources, and at one point, he's literally going through DMV records trying to find men with red or reddish blonde hair. Could you imagine going through hundreds and hundreds and going, oh, this could be? And not to mention that if you're bald and don't have a beard, you still got to look into them, right?
Yeah, you might overlook something. So that's painstaking work. He spends years doing that. But something changes in 2018. So that September of 2018, he decided to give our old friend genetic genealogy a try. And the suspect DNA was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs a few weeks after that. Now, remember, they've got the blood on the bra. They know the semen was the boyfriend's, or the ex-boyfriend rather, and he was cleared as a suspect, but they've got a few other things. So it took another few months, but finally it did give them a new suspect to look at. And this was a man named Steve Branch. So investigators start looking into this Steve Branch guy some more. And it turned out he did live in Sitka at the time that Jessica was killed. And he also had a record that included sexually assaulting another teenage female in 1996. Now, for this, he was arrested, but he was acquitted in 1997. So it's like, oh, well, did they get the wrong guy? But let's talk about this for a minute, though, because this was 2 months before Jessica's murder. The victim said, Steve Branch raped me. She reported it, and she knew exactly who he was. So how did he get acquitted? Well, he takes the stand. He cries his eyes out. He says, I made such a horrible mistake. This was terrible, but it was consensual. I just misunderstood the situation. It started out consensual and it just, escalated and I misinterpreted what she was saying. And he is bawling and I am so sorry. Whatever. And it was actually a pretty fast jury deliberation too. And so he was acquitted quickly. But history goes on to show us here that maybe he was not entirely truthful there.
And in 2010, he moved to Arkansas and looked as if he had been there since. The Alaska Division reaches out to Arkansas State and the police said, hey, we need this guy's DNA. Can you help us out here? Now, Arkansas follows him around for a few weeks, waiting for him to throw something away that they could use. It took weeks, but they finally got something from one of his relatives. It's the best what they got, right? You use what you got. Or it did at least tell them that pretty likely this is Steve, and it's probably the person's DNA on Jessica's clothes and body. So they do have a connection. It does kind of match in that removed relationship kind of way. And on August 3rd, 2020, investigators went to Branch's house to question him. And they also asked, hey, can we get a DNA sample? Naturally, he says, I'm innocent. I have nothing to do with this. And nope, I will not give you my DNA. Investigators had to leave at that point, but they intended to come back, and when they did, they were going to come back with a search warrant.
However, things take a little bit of a turn here because just 30 minutes after leaving Steve Branch's home, Steve Branch shot himself. Now, when we hear this happen, a lot of times it's seen as an admission of guilt, which I think it is here as well, right? The jig is up. I'm caught. I'm not going down for this. Well, there were people around town who were like, no, that's not what's happening. He did that because he's already been through it once before. He was already falsely accused once before, and he just couldn't take it. However, he is now deceased. Although he is deceased, investigators still got his DNA. They still have a case to close, whether they are excluding him, including him, whatever. And guess what? It was a perfect match. Steve Branch was definitely the killer. Interestingly, he had not been on their radar before, despite having been arrested for that rape right before Jessica was killed. So nothing popped up, nothing. I mean, this was just completely random. Also, this meant that his DNA was on file because he did have a previous charge, and they could have used that. But for a while there, remember, they thought they had their guy. So when we say that he was never on the radar, it's because they're thinking that Bingham, this drunk guy, blacked out and did it. So they're not actively pursuing the case anymore. This guy just walks in saying, oh, I'm having nightmares that I killed someone. And they're like, oh, case closed. So since this trial, we know now who actually committed this crime. So what's the deal with Bingham? Well, since then, Bingham has been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. He lost an eye due to diabetes complication. He has worked really hard in construction. He likes to buy old watches and fix them up, and he has a girlfriend.
Now, this is coming from Commissioner Amanda Price. Now, she works at the Department of Public Safety. She says, while nothing will ease the pain or bring Jessica back, I am humbled and proud of the work that so many law enforcement professionals did over the years to bring closure to her family and friends. They'll never forget about Jessica or the people that loved her. Each cold case represents a victim and a family that is grieving while waiting justice. Each case, no matter how old, matters to us. Now, Jessica was born May 3rd, 1979, and died May 4th, 1996. Jessica was described as absolutely loving to fish. She loved cooking and, quote, Thanksgiving pie making marathons. So she was definitely one of those, if you go to her house, you're not going to starve.
Yeah, and I mean, they would stay up on Thanksgiving and she would marathon make pies. That was her goal. She would make a pie for everybody.
Her family would often take fishing trips. She also hoped to study photography. She was a Willie Nelson fan, and she was also described as spunky and didn't give up easily. Now, she is survived by 3 sisters, and she loved to laugh, tease, and be super silly. So just your all-around, she sounds like you would want her as your best friend.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that she got justice, although the whole situation with Bingham is horrifying as well, because if the DNA doesn't match and they are able to present that DNA at trial, how the hell did he get to trial?
They were pushing a cause is what was happening.
Dang.
They really thought they had their man, and they were hoping just to push through the defects in their case, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
Thank goodness.
It's terrible. And I mean, there's people who are like, no, we were with him all night. And it was multiple people with that alibi. And I hope he got some new friends, because that's just a terrible, terrible prank to pull on someone. Look what it did. Look what happened because of it. My gosh.
And that they pulled that prank relentlessly from what it sounded like.
Yeah.
They were continuing this prank. And, this poor guy, he has such low self-esteem at the point where he's hanging out with these friends. And they probably did not help his self-esteem whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. Very sad all around. So that wraps up this story. Few quick housekeeping announcement thingies. Update on the live show. Our tickets are coming any moment. In fact, by the time this episode releases, they might be out. So be checking our social media pages and our group and stuff, because we're expecting them any second although it's a few days until this drops. The date, of course, is May 6th. It's here in Birmingham, Alabama at Wild Rose Cafe. The time for it is 6:30 to 9:30. That's something we did not have yet. And as of now, we do have 100% confirmed Josh Hallmark from True Crime Bullshit, Brandon Schexnayder from Southern Gothic, Jen from our True Crime podcast is coming. Cam cannot come, but Jen is coming. Charlie from Crime Lines and Nina from Already Gone are likely. I don't want to say 100%, but they are very likely. And there are others who are considering it as well. So it's shaping up to be a lot of really amazing podcasters. Again, it's going to be kind of panel style. For example, in the Atlanta one panel of 4 or 5 podcasters did a local case. Then we did the Christmas cases. So it'll be some sort of mix. And then a meet and greet at the end. The last little bit will be everybody just hanging out. Wild Roast does not serve alcohol, but you can bring alcohol. That is perfectly fine. They will serve coffee, smoothies, snacks. We're considering having a Corpus Delicti blend of coffee made, which is kind of exciting. So all of it's shaping up nicely. All that to say, tickets are coming very, very soon. So if it's not out by this point, keep checking.
If you're watching us on YouTube right now, what you are seeing is Rocky's QR code. Now, if you scan that code, you will be taken to the link with all of Road to Redemption episodes. There are 5 in total. And that tells the story of Rocky and his journey through a horrific experience. And we may never know the true killer of Ludi May. So go ahead. Click that QR code, go back and listen to the Road to Redemption. There's a lot of extra stuff.
Yeah, there's articles that have been written elsewhere. There's a link to the petition that his lawyer is putting together. If you want to sign a letter, which we are collecting for his clemency package on behalf of the lawyers, that address is in our group. It's pinned to the top of our Facebook group, which is Corpus Delicti Discussion Group. Or send us a message and we will give you the template. If you aren't sure what to write, we'll give you the address, whatever you need. But we would love to have as many of those letters as possible because hopefully the time for the clemency package will be soon-ish.
If you want to join us as a delectable and join us for live Patreon events, also free merch, a quarterly awesome surprise box that you will get at the end of every quarter, go ahead and look at that YouTube screen, and it is going to be patreon.com/Corpus Delicti. You get a whole bunch of cool stuff. Not only do you get to hang out with us on our live events, if you're $3 or more, you get awesome access to our Discord page. It is so much fun. We right now are just head deep into this Alec Murdaugh trial.
Oh, man.
Lindsay and I have been watching this trial, and it
Wait, which trial? Was it the Alec Murdaugh trial or the Alex Murdaugh trial? It's like Corpus Delicti, Corpus Delicti. No one knows how to say it.
Yeah, hopefully when this comes out, we'll have a verdict. We don't know. So it is such a wild and crazy case, but I would love to have a Patreon just to discuss this
Oh my
case.
gosh, we would need like 10. Jen and I are both thinking hung jury, by the way.
Yeah, I think hung jury. So that is my prediction. I think Lindsay's too. But don't forget, and $10 or more gets you your boxes every single quarter. But
which we're about to send those out because it's March. It's the last month of the quarter. So that's super fun. Be on the lookout for that.
So I think that covers everything. But until then, you know what they said to Felicia.
Bye.
Bye.